Welcome to Writer's Life, an ongoing conversation with writers, authors, and folks in the publishing industry. I'm your host, Marvel Harrison, Publishing Director, Mimbres Press of Western New Mexico University. It is a pleasure to share a conversation today with James McGrath Morris, locally known as Jamie Morris, an author of numerous biographies, one of a newspaper publisher and politician, Joseph Pulitzer. Another of Jamie's biographies told the story of two World War I ambulance drivers, novelists Ernest Hemingway and John Dos Passos. A third was about Ethel Payne, which really interests me, a Black reporter who stood against racial and gender bias to cover the civil rights movement. Morris's latest biography is on Hillerman. Morris is well known for writing a biography that reads like a novel, which I so personally admire and appreciate. He is a 2022 Mystery Writers of America Edgar Award finalist, a New York Times best-selling author, and lucky for me and us, our very own Mimbres Press is proud to call Jamie a board member. Welcome to Writer's Life, Jamie.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me, and thank you for all the sweet things you said.
Well, there's lots more that could be said, but I think our listeners want to hear from you. And how did you get rolling started in being an author?
Well, it depends if you want the long version or the short version. The long version dates back to the 1960s, when on Sundays I used to sit on my parents' bedroom and on their bed, and they would read the Herald Tribune newspaper. And I loved comics, but I also discovered obituaries and became an early reader of obituaries. And obituaries are, if you think about it, mini biographies. So I was a very poor student, in trouble all the time, and never did the reading I was asked, but the teachers were always puzzled by my knowledge of history, and because every obituary not only tells you the story of life, but if it's an important industrialist, tells you a little bit about industrial growth and the Industrial Revolution and everything. So I was quite learned from these mini biographies. So later, when I became a newspaper reporter and a radio reporter, what I loved was work that was like biographical work. I did the hard news stuff. I covered the state legislature, for instance, in New Mexico. But I loved doing features, and features were really often biographies, of a state senator or of a writer or an artist or something like that. So that's always been a passion. But I never seemed to stick to one particular form of employment. I spent 10 years as a journalist, 10 years as a magazine editor and book publisher, 10 years as a high school teacher, and now about 20 years writing biographies. My aunt used to always say, Jamie, why don't you stick with one thing? And in defense, I realized I really was sticking with one thing, which was writing throughout it. As a reporter, I wrote. As an editor, I was writing. As a publisher, I was rewriting people's work. And when I was in high school, it was an extraordinary experience for me because, unlike most jobs, the office or the factory shuts for long times, like the summer. So I was able to write my first commercial book. I'd written another book prior to this, two books prior to this. Wrote a book called The Rose Man of Sing Sing, which was a biography of a 19th century, very famous New York City editor, much the way people know who Ben Bradlee was, who was the editor of the Washington Post for years. At the end of his life, he murders his wife and is sent to Sing Sing, where he grows acres and acres of roses. So the book permitted me to spend page after page detailing yellow journalism and what journalism was like at its heyday in the 1890s and the turn of the 20th century, covering the sinking of the Titanic and all kinds of glorious things like that. But the hook was this intriguing fellow locked up in the famous Sing Sing prison. And the commercial is really the critical success rather than the commercial success of that book led to HarperCollins commissioning me to write a big book, one of these doorstop books, and that's the biography of Joseph Pulitzer. So I left teaching high school and went off to do that, and I'm on my, fifth or sixth biography, and the last is what you said was Tony Hillerman.
Well, that's interesting to me because I think about an obituary. Yes, a mini biography, but I think usually with a a gloss over of anything that didn't go all that well in one's life.
Yes and no, and that has to do with what obituaries you're reading.
Okay.
Local newspapers tend to be very nice and kind to the citizens who die. And then also, readers don't always distinguish between these two, but they're paid obituaries that run in most of these small newspapers.
Right.
And those, of course, make you into a saint. Serious obituary writing, like the kind that still goes on in the New York Times or The Economist, so famous for this, does give you a full value, a measure of a person's life, and will recount the unpleasant moments that they might not want to remember. In fact, what's really fascinating, and I encourage people to dip into the New York Times obituaries, they often include interviews with the person who died that were granted and on the condition that they would not be published until after they died. So sometimes people are able to say things after they're gone in their obituary that just solves some problems, much the way, Woodward and Bernstein revealed who Deep Throat was when somebody's passed. I mean, the rules of the game change when somebody leaves.
Yeah. I have a cousin who's taken a lot of writing courses, and I've always asked her about doing a book, and she says, "Oh, I have to wait till everybody dies."
That's a problem with memoir. And
Yeah.
it's a very serious problem. And I've been dabbling in fiction, and I know that what relatives I have who are alive are going to say, "Oh, you based that person on your father, you based that person on your mother or your brother," or things, and so uncomplimentary. And that's really not fair to the writer. Where I think fiction writers are inspired and pick up things, but it doesn't mean that's the person. My father had this interesting trait. He loved building a fire in the winter in the fireplace. And he'd stand with his back to the fire to warm up. And he'd rise up on his toes and go down again. You would just hardly notice it's kind of going up and down and up and down. So I gave one of the characters in my book that trait because it seems so interesting and unusual, and it's stuck with me now 60 years later. But that doesn't mean that character is my father. And I think that's the problem for fiction. Memoirists, I mean, I just feel so sad for them. You're right, everybody has to die, because if you're going to be honest about your brothers and sisters and aunts and cousins, you could be in deep trouble.
As a family systems trained psychologist, it would be a long haul for lots of people to tell their authentic self.
Now, this occurs in biography too.
Right.
Now, I was always known about writing about really dead people. Pulitzer died in 1911. So, in fact, his family learned more about their great-great-grandfather from me. I'm not complimenting myself, from me than they did from their own family, because a 500-page book documents his life. But there was no one really I could offend in doing that. Whereas when I wrote Ethel Payne, towards the end of the book, I depended on some interviews of people who were still alive, who remembered her. And I had a long debate with my editor about one particular anecdote that was bordered on cruel about one of Ethel Payne's friends. And I decided in the end to take it out. Only in the sense that I didn't think it advanced the story, and if anything, it would hurt this person at the end of her life with no great purpose. It wasn't like some uncovering of some awful thing that had happened or something like that. So even biographers have to be sensitive to this issue.
Right.
And usually we say something about it. The Hillerman biography is very complicated because Hillerman only died in 2008.
Right.
And he has children he had many children who are still alive. And I had to persuade them to let me interview them at some length. And I set up very special conditions by which what I would use from the interviews. And his daughter, Anne Hillerman, has the literary rights, meaning my use of the photographs, Tony's writings, Tony's letters, Tony's postcards, everything. So she and I signed a contract in which I would submit the manuscript to her twice, once when it was finished and once when it was edited. Anything she found factually wrong, we would fix. Now, who wouldn't want to do that? I mean, but anything she objected to would be taken under serious consideration. So meaning, had I uncovered something about her dad that I felt was important and she objected to, I could still retain the right to put it in. Turns out it worked out wonderfully. He was a pretty saintly figure. But the other issue I had was I interviewed Navajos, I interviewed readers, and I interviewed Tony's children. And these are not public figures. They're not like the former Speaker of the House or Joe Biden, who spent all his time in the public. And the rules with them are entirely different. If I go up to somebody like the governor of New Mexico and I ask a question, or I interviewed Bill Richardson for the book, for instance, the late Bill Richardson, what they say gets to be quoted. They can't say, oh, gee, I didn't mean to say that. Would you strike me? But individual people are not public figures, and they're often not media savvy. They don't quite understand how the media works. Mm-hmm. So I think those of us who interview, and I'm trying not to make it sound like Joe Citizen or everyday people, but people who are not public figures, we have two obligations. One is to instruct them to what's going on. Mm-hmm. I'm going to interview you for several hours. We're going to have a long tape. I'm going to make a type transcript from this. And I'm going to go through and select things that you have said that help me tell the story of your father, Tony Hillerman. And I'm going to, at times, clean up the language. Now, by that, I mean, when you and I are talking right now, we're making grammatical errors all the time, verbally. Mm-hmm. We use a plural verb when we have a singular subject or whatever it be, and we understand each other. But when that appears in print, it tends to make us look a little foolish. So I always tell people that, a verbal interview, when I type the transcript, everything will remain the same, except if you've made a little grammatical mistake or didn't put a pause or something like that, I'll put that in. But lastly, with those individuals, I gave them a right to see those quotations that I decided would probably show up in the book, not for sure. And that way they could review them. And occasionally they thought, ooh, that seemed a little harsh about my dad, and I don't want the world to, that kind of thing. And so it doesn't go in the book. Those are very different rules, and I think they're very important because we writers have ethical responsibilities in what we're doing. People will read the Tony Hillman book, get a full view of Tony Hillman, but when they're reading their children's account, they're somewhat measured because, if you interview 5 children about their father, you find out they're 5 different fathers. So, I use them judiciously and in cooperation with them. And it worked out just fine. And the story came out very well. Well,
and the truth is that he was a different father to each one of those children. Mm-hmm. The date, the time, the place of their birth, and what was going on. And
particularly because 5 of the children were adopted. Anne is the only biological children, and each of these children come, if you know anything about adoption, no matter how wonderful it is, a child comes with baggage. And one of the children who died recently, Dan Hillerman, told me a story, which is in the book, that he'd never, as a child, felt grass, a lawn. He'd never walked on a lawn, and he'd been pretty much kept in a crib. And when he went to bed the first night, Marie went to put him to sleep, and he still had some hamburger meat tucked into his cheeks because he felt so insecure about where he'd get his next meal. It's a pretty hard way to start life. Yeah. And he was more than willing to discuss it. And those children felt enormous gratitude to Tony and Marie for having adopted them, even though each of them had some struggles in life, but found a place.
There's no doubt. I mean, attachment disorder is real.
Yeah.
And abandonment, no matter how great a family you end up in, is a reality for someone who's been through that. As a biographer, I'm thinking about my friend, the late Richard Ben Kramer, who wrote, probably the definitive biography on Joe DiMaggio, and some other books. And I remember him sharing with me about how much he immersed himself in the life of, and how difficult that was, and particularly on the DiMaggio biography, because he wasn't the most decent of human beings when you got into the guts of.
I've got that experience, trust me.
Yeah, Yeah.
So Tony Hillerman was like a tonic. Joseph Pulitzer was just an awful person. Charles Chapin, who murdered his wife, was not exactly a noble figure. Hemingway may be one of the great writers of the 20th century, but a despicable person and cruel and awful. And I used to say sometimes I had to take a shower at night just to get into bed after working on it all
Okay.
day.
Yeah.
It's a very personal form of art, or a craft. I like to think of biography more as a craft, in that you are obsessively pursuing aspects of another individual's life. And I'm debating whether or not to do yet another biography before I call it quits. And one of the discussions we have in the family is sometimes when I come to dinner, I'm not really there. And it's very hard on my wife. It's a ménage à trois.
Hmm.
I get up in the morning, I'm thinking about my subject. I'm in the shower, I'm thinking about my subject. I'm going to go to Chicago and walk from Ethel Payne's house to the school that she went to, where kids threw stones at her. I went to Hungary to walk in the streets of this little tiny town where Pulitzer was born to get a feel for it. I cooked recipes. I found recipes that Ethel Payne had in some file box. I cooked some of those things. We have an obsession in trying to get to the story. And I think one of the ways to look at this is that biographers are portrait artists. Historians are landscape painters. And so we bring to the canvas an obsessive need to know everything possible about the person. But we also bring to the canvas our own acculturation, our own childhood, our own socialization. So writing about Ethel Payne as a white man who grew up in some privilege, writing about a Black woman who grew up in South Side of Chicago, offered a number of challenges. And I know I'm not saying something that's not demonstrable, but Black audiences found my book just fine. They liked it a lot. I mean, my visits to Black high schools were very successful, and the kids liked the book and all that. So, but the point of it is that if I'd been a 30-year-old Black woman writing this book, the book would be different. Does that mean mine is not accurate or hers is more accurate? No, it's because it's what's between the lines that matters. And we bring to it our own sense of the world. So for instance, one of the things I discovered, I was interviewing an old friend of Ethel Payne's, and I made some point about something, and she leaned back at the table and said, that's so cute. I thought, what is she talking about? What's cute about this work? You can feel my little hairs going up my back. And she said, you get so angry about the stuff that we put up with for 50 years. Like the not being able to find a bathroom in Washington, D.C. in the 1950s if you're a Black woman. And it dawned on me that my anger was noticeable in between the lines. But if I had been her writing about Ethel Payne, having been so scarred by that aspect, those things might not have come out. So I'm not saying mine's more accurate. I'm just saying that we bring to it different perspectives, different brushstrokes. Yeah. The issue, which was the same issue for Ethel Payne, how did she cover these racist creeps in the U.S. Senate who are using a word I can't use on the air right now, but in public speeches? And she said, I can't be objective. I mean, the laws bar me from getting on a bus without sitting in the back. That affects me. I can't be objective, but I can be fair. And that's what I chose to do. So even in representing some of the characters who were, these Southern governors and others who were just incredible racists to her and to everything else, I just did what she did, which was often let them hang by their own petard by quoting them.
Right.
I mean, let them speak.
Yeah.
I didn't need, and that's one of the fundamental differences, I think, between journalism of her era and now. A lot of what masquerades for journalism today is people sort of yelling at each other on television and modifying words in their copy all the time. Whereas, the journalists at that point were much more staying with the story and letting the story tell itself without adding all these value-added words about it. And an outrageous move today, such and such happened. I mean, they'd never write like that. But you look at the copy today and it's filled with that kind of judgment. So anyway, I really get off the topic, don't I, Marvel?
And no, I think it's wonderful. And I think what's most remarkable is a biographer, and you particularly have brought to life somebody that I wouldn't have known about.
Yeah, that's the great reward.
I mean, it's like you say about the portrait,
Yeah.
and I'm not going into a museum. I'm sitting in my own living room, enjoying the history of the
Mhm.
stories told by, and I think it's a
Well,
real gift to humankind.
when I look at my wife, very kindly framed all my covers, and when I look at them, um, most of the books could have been very well written by somebody else.
Mhm.
Somebody could have written Tony Hillerman's biography of Joseph Pulitzer, but my coming across Ethel Payne and giving her a place on the bookshelf, to me, is my single greatest achievement as a writer. And my second greatest achievement as a writer is it spawned an absolutely glorious illustrated children's book by somebody else, who, because I wrote the biography, there's this wonderful, wonderful biographical children's book out there. And I love the thought that children, are reading this book and being inspired by her. It's not my words, it's not my book, but I love that effect that it had.
Yeah, well, you created the link, didn't you?
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. Yes.
Mhm. Well, it has been a real pleasure spending this time with you today, Jamie. And, it's been a joy to speak with you. And thanks to everyone who's joined us. I'm
Well,
Marvel Harrison. And did you have something else to
no, I
add?
was going to say thank you for letting me ramble like this.
I,
It's
I
a
think,
very solitary task being a writer, and to be able to answer a question with a long answer is great fun. So thank you very much.
well,
And thanks to the viewers for their patience.
it has been a joy to speak with you today, Jamie. And thanks to everyone who's joined us. I'm Marvel Harrison. And from all of us at Mimbres Press, may your day be sparked with curiosity and wonder. See you again on the next Writer's Life.